Hello there and welcome back to my channel. I'm One Bright Shape and today I'll be sharing with you 7 tips and tricks for more realistic looking watercolor paintings. So I hope you enjoy. So for this tutorial I decided to use my latest watercolor portrait because in this one I try to have a more realistic approach to the skin. I usually just shade everything with two colors mainly, which is red and blue. Red for the areas with more blood flow and blue for the areas where the blood isn't as present on the face. But in here I try to have a more rendered and finished look to the piece. And so let's start with the first tip, which is to learn how to draw first before heading into painting. And this tip is very useful because you will find that if this is your first time doing art and you just want to go ahead and use watercolors before you know how to draw things, then you're gonna find it very hard to use, because if you don't have the foundations that you acquire from drawing, which are just basic shading techniques and blocking in the shadows and shapes of a face or of an object, then you will most likely have a hard time painting them right away without having like a nice or neat sketch behind it. And that's not necessarily always the case. I mean, you could be the most artistic person in the world and have a natural inclination to painting and be better at painting than drawing, but usually for a regular person it would be better to start with dry media first because you have more control over it than you have with wet media. Dry media referring to charcoal, pen, colored pencils, and also some forms of pastel. The reason behind this is because if you start right away with the painting process or with the wet techniques, you'll see that it's kind of hard to control the results you get from them, and you have to make sure you know where to place everything before you head on to the painting part of it. Now, the second tip is kind of related to the first one, which is to have a good reference photo. And by good, I mean that it has two things: a good lighting and a good ratio compared to the paper in which you're drawing. A good lighting because if it's a photograph that has diffuse lighting, then you're gonna find it very hard if it's your first time painting a face or painting an object or painting whatever. You're gonna find it very hard to be able to give it dimension and depth to your drawing or to your painting, because since you're not used to doing art, you're gonna see that you need to build a reference library first before trying to attempt more difficult things. And if you don't know where to place shadows or where shadows would be, if the photograph that you're using doesn't have enough information, you're gonna find it very hard to imagine where all those things would be. And that's especially true for faces or for portraits. If you want to have a realistic looking portrait, what you would want to do is get a reference photo from Google Images or from any site on the internet that has just one light source. And most of the time these photographs are in black and white, which is also very good if you're a beginner, because black and white photos really show you what matters or what makes a face look three-dimensional, and that is the shadows and the light. So in black and white photos, you are really able to tell where you should place your darkest darks and your lightest lights. So if you want to start with portraiture, the best thing to do would be to go and find one of these black and white images and just try to reference from it. And don't trace, or well, trace if you want, but I would recommend you to first learn how to get your proportions right by sight and not tracing, because if you trace then you become lazy and you don't really learn from it. There's this awesome artist on YouTube called Lioba. She does a lot of traditional work and mostly in watercolors as well as oils. And she shares something like this on one of her videos, in which she explains a little bit about her technique that involves drawing or making a composition on Photoshop, and then from that composition trying to place it on the canvas or on the paper. And she tells us that if you're experienced enough, tracing is fine because you already know where to place things. But if you're just starting out, the best thing you can do is just try to mimic that reference without using any method of tracing, like tracing paper or a projector or something like that, because you're not really learning from it. And also the ratio, if you find a picture that is like a squared picture and you're working on a rectangular piece of paper, sometimes it's hard to see where things should be placed place. And what I usually do when I face this problem is to snap a pic with my phone of the reference photo that I'm using or that I found online. And then since the phone and the paper have similar ratios, I mean they're both rectangles, you can easily place things on your canvas and you don't really have to adjust things from your initial composition. And so yeah, that's tip number 2. Tip number 3 is subtlety. If you want to have realistic looking portraits, especially in watercolors, the key to doing so is subtlety. You have to have very subtle changes in color in the skin. You have to have various hues of different shades of colors. For example, you have to have blues, purples, yellows, reds. But you have to transition between these colors with very much care, because if you don't, then it's going to end up looking kind of cartoony. And in order for you to have a very subtle transition in between colors, what you will want to do is layer very lightly and very slowly. And this brings me to my next point, which is your color palette. Sometimes you can get, if you're just starting out with art, or even if you're somewhat experienced with it, color can be very overwhelming. So by having a limited palette, you're ensured yourself that you can focus more on getting the contrast and the values right, instead of worrying about what colors you're going to use to achieve those changes in value. And to fix this problem, what you can do is refer to the Zorn palette. You can Google it, and it's by Anders Zorn, I believe. And he was a painter master and was very well known for using only 3 or 4 main colors on his painting, and with those 4 colors you can mix them to create various shades of different skin tones or colors that are present on the skin. And that's basically what I do what I did for this painting. I only used yellow, a blue, burnt sienna as my kind of red, and Payne's gray for my Payne's gray was sort of my blues. And then for the colored pencils, I did use some other shades, but I try to stay within the range of those initial hues. And now another important tip is to have soft and hard edges, because if you only have soft edges, your painting is going to look very blurry. I mean, again, if that's the look that you're going for, then it's totally fine, you keep doing you. But if what you want is to achieve more realistic looking portraits, then what you will want to do is have a balanced mixture between these 2 different edges. And to get soft edges in watercolor, what you will want to do is to apply a wet on wet technique, and that means to wet your paper and then apply the paint over that wet area, and that will allow you to have a more to get rid of all the hard edges that you may have gotten had you only placed the paint on top of the dry paper. And for the hard edges, what you do is just let dry the surface and then go in with paint. That's especially useful, for example, in areas that you can really see a change in plane, they're called. And a change in plane would be, for example, the folds of the eye, like for example the eye bags. You can really see there that there's a change in texture and everything, or a change in height and thus in lighting. So having a mixture of both of these edges is pretty important if you want to achieve a realistic look. Now, in order to do this, you have to have a lot of patience, which is our next point. If you want to achieve a realistic look, you need to be patient, because as you saw on the beginning of the painting, there was a part in which it looked like it had been painted by a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, and nothing looked like what it was supposed to look like. The shapes were too abstract to look like anything really, and so you have to push through that ugly stage and remember that if you don't work past it, then obviously you're never going to get a nice result. You have to be aware that you're gonna have to deal with this ugly stage, and that eventually the portrait is going to start taking shape. So yeah, patience is important, and then practice. If you're practicing like drawing 10 times a week, or I don't know, 5 drawings a day or whatever, it won't matter if you're doing the wrong exercises. Now, there is this digital artist on YouTube called Bobby Chu. I'm sure you've heard of him before, and he's the creator of Schoolism. He has a YouTube channel in here as well. I suggest you to check him out. I will leave every channel that I talked about in this video down in the description so that you guys can go and check them out. And basically what he says in one of his videos is that it doesn't matter how much you practice if you don't do like good practices. And that's very true. If you're just drawing circles all day long and then you try to draw a rectangle, you're gonna find that you're not as good drawing rectangles as you thought you were going to be, because you were practicing at the end of the day, right? But you have to make sure that you're doing the right exercises and the right practices to get better at art. And so yeah, that was the last piece of advice that I had for you guys. And if you enjoyed the video, or if you have any tips that I didn't mention in this video, definitely do leave a comment down below. I would love to see if you have any more tips that I could use also for my work. And if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And also, if you enjoy the channel, make sure to subscribe. I post videos every Sunday. And yeah, I think that's about it. If you want to check out more of my work, you can head over to my Instagram. I leave my social media down below as well. And thanks for watching.